Then they looked at what the expected outcomes of those interventions were going to be. Then they looked at the costs of those interventions, and what that did was allow them to create a much more detailed picture of the overall cost and objectives and needs that they were trying to address, and cost those out up front, and really was a way to represent the scale of the types of problems that they were trying to take on, and it also gave them a much stronger sense or a clearer sense of the cost involved with the different activities that they were looking at to address those costs. And I think making sure that as you develop your vision and mission, you think about those big picture issues about what is the scale and the scope of the initiative that you're considering, and what does that mean in terms of specific cost. And a lot of what we'll talk about today is how to go through a similar process to make sure that you're quantifying exactly how much you're going to be expending on the different activities that you're thinking about to allow you to improve the way that you plan for and finance the different elements of your overall initiative. So the second issue, the second principle of sustainability are outcomes. And I know many of you are focused on developing your logic models and defining what outcomes you're looking for, identifying the indicators. And I think one of the most important things for you to do is to make sure that you connect your data collection and evaluation to your strategic financing plan to create an outcomes-based approach. And one of the resources that I'll make sure is available is the work of Mark Friedman and his work with outcomes-based accountability. And he has a number of web-based resources that are available free of charge, so guidebooks and slideshows that go into more detail about outcomes-based budgeting. But I think the most important thing to think about now is to look for synergy between the activities that you're doing and the development of your strategic financing plan. So again, we'll talk in more detail about what goes into a strategic financing plan, but for now, you would use your logic model as the foundation, because that's where you're spending most of your time looking at what kind of outcomes you're trying to achieve and the indicators that will tell you whether you've achieved them. And my suggestion to you is that you organize your logic model and your strategic plans by specific strategies and activities with clearly defined outcomes and the indicators that will tell you if you reach them, and a plan for tracking them. And what that allows you to do is then use your strategic financing plan to cost out each strategy and its related activities to allow you to see what you're getting for your investment. So the basic gist of outcomes-based planning and outcomes-based programs is that you are able over time to see what kind of outcomes you're producing for your investments. And then that allows you to shift resources to support successful strategies, reduce or terminate programs and services that aren't getting a good return on investment, and it gives you a much higher degree of control over the planning process, and it makes sure that you're pushing the resources that you have available to you where they're going to do the most good. So two important things to remember here. The first is use your outcomes to attract funders. And some common tools that other communities have used are things like children's report cards, where you track the various indicators that you've identified in your needs assessment and your logic model over time, convening community summits to bring together different community stakeholders to, again, attract support for the initiative, and both to talk about the successes that your initiative has had in concrete detail, rooted in the outcomes you've been tracking, but also the needs that still remain, again, based in solid data. Another specific example of how communities have gone about this is the idea of creating business cases. And one of the resources that I'll send along is the case study of the Polk County business case. And Polk County is in Iowa. And this particular project was headed up by Charlie Bruner, who's a name that probably most of you will recognize from the Child and Family Policy Center. And they were working on an early childhood initiative and were trying to attract funding from the local private sector stakeholders. And they realized that they couldn't make their case in the same way they made it to the usual service providers and public agencies. And so what they did was created a business case for investing in early childhood programs in the county, and very strategically used the language and the wording of the business community, and then took the business plan to places like the United Way, that's obviously connected with the business community, the Chamber of Commerce, and they made a very clear case by looking at the return on investment that they would achieve through devoting more resources to early childhood issues to make the case to the business community to support their efforts. And what they were able to do was get much more leverage with the type of funding strategies that the private sector is often ambivalent about supporting, things like local sales taxes, and other ways to drive revenue into the public system. And so I think the idea of creating a business case is one example of how you focus on both the challenges that you're trying to confront and the potential benefits of the outcomes that you'll create in a language that attracts different types of funders than might usually sit around your tables. The second most important point is that to make sure there is a clear process in place to connect the outcomes that you're tracking in your strategic financing plan and your overall strategic plans and the decision-making process about financing. And that makes sure that you're financing what works. So you need to achieve clarity, especially at this point, to make sure that the data you're gathering gets fed back into the decision-making process, and that you're tracking how much you're spending on each of the activities, the outcomes that those are producing, and in that way, you're able to make much better, more informed decisions about how you're distributing your resources. So because you're still in the process of developing your initiative, this is an excellent opportunity to make sure you've established that clear connection between the data collection and evaluation activities and the overall planning process. And I think the strategic financing plan gives you a vehicle for making sure that process is created up front and folks are clear about how it actually works. So let's take a quick time out and see if there are any questions. Going once? Twice? Okay. So now the third principle of sustainability and financing is taking a strategic approach to financing. And I think one of the biggest errors that initiatives often make is to go after funding first and then decide what to do with it. So the funding and the funding availability is what's driving the initiative, rather than using your needs assessments and the other planning work you've done to drive thinking about your overall strategic vision, then defining your needs, figuring out the cost of your strategies, and then figuring out your financing strategies. So I'll talk about 5 specific financing strategies in a minute. But I think taking a strategic approach to financing means at least 4 things. So the first thing it means is making sure that you're aligning your funding sources with the strategies that you're pursuing. So especially this means knowing the time period over which you have access to different types of funding, and making sure that you're aligning the different sources of funding with the strategies that you're pursuing. So, for example, if you have a short-term source of funding, that doesn't make sense to use that to invest in services that you'll provide over the long term. It makes more sense to use that funding for leverage or glue money. So basically activities that will be aligned with the availability of the funding and the restrictions on its use.